it's my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor, Doctor, and Provost David Carballo. He's not only a very distinguished scholar who has devoted his life to studying Mexican archaeology, particularly Teotihuacan and other areas, and teaching it here at Beyond and Beyond. He has written incredibly interesting books that I highly recommend you, that give a very creative view at Mexican history, starting from both sides, from the Spanish and from the pre-Hispanic Nahuatl people. After that, excuse me? David is going to talk about his book too and give you some information. You can Google his name, David Carballo, and you will find articles, books, research. He has also been the advisor to many students that have completed incredibly interesting doctoral dissertations on Mexican archaeology, and work with the leading people in the field, both from the US, Europe, and of course Mexico, and particularly with colleagues at UNAM. So he's very close to UNAM. He's a honorary Puma too. So without further ado, David, we want you to talk a little bit about your work, about BU, but also about sports in Boston, that you are also a very enthusiastic, like all Bostonians, of our local teams. So, muchísimas gracias y bienvenido otra vez.
Gracias, Benjamin. Thank you to Benjamin and Hector for the invitation. It is President's Day here, so it's a day off, but it's always a pleasure to talk about archaeology in Mexico and about sports in Boston. And so I thought it'd be fun to do both of them. And so, yeah, I have been working in the archaeology of Mesoamerica since the 25 years, I guess, since 95. And that included first in Honduras, in a Maya site called Copan, and then Belize. Then my first time in Mexico was in Chiapas, doing some ceramic analysis of some of the earliest villages in Mesoamerica. And then for the last 20 years, I've been in the Altiplano, and in particular in Teotihuacan and in the state of Tlaxcala. So two different projects. In Tlaxcala, the interval that we were studying by excavating sites was right before Teotihuacan became a very large city. And so some of the focus there was on the development of early urbanism, and then how the region was affected by Teotihuacan becoming the biggest city in the Americas. And then in Teotihuacan itself, I've worked on 3 projects at the Pyramid of the Moon, and that was part of my dissertation project. That was directed by Saburo Sugiyama, a Japanese researcher, and Ruben Cabrera, who's from the Zona Arqueológico de Teotihuacan. And then I started my own project. Let's see, this would be about 4 kilometers to the south. So Teotihuacan is so big that you could go from the Moon Pyramid in the north down to the south in a barrio or district that's called Tlahinga. And this was very different than like a pyramid complex, because it was just a regular district where normal people, like non-elite or common people, lived. So the goal there was just to understand what was life like for regular Teotihuacanos. What were their apartment compounds like? How did they organize their neighborhoods? And more recently, we were excavating at the Barrio Center. So just like those of you who know some about the Mexica Aztecs know that there were barrios, and then there would be central places called the Capulcos, where there would be the Calmecac or the Telpochcali, the schools. There would be temples and civic areas. And so we're starting to understand some of the same in Teotihuacan 1,000 years before the Mexicas. And then one other project that I got involved in for 2 years was at a palace compound called Plaza de las Columnas, which is right across the Calzada de los Muertos from the Sun Pyramid. And so that's very different. That is a high elite complex. So we can compare what the richest or more powerful occupants of Teotihuacan, how they lived compared to the normal people, like most Teotihuacanos, by comparing those two projects. So all of that has been, tremendously rewarding, and it was very difficult to not be able to go to Mexico. I was in Mexico in March when COVID started shutting things down, and was at Teotihuacan and gave some talks, and things were starting to get serious with the virus, and I made it back right before they were starting to shut down flights. And it's been a disappointment not to be able to go over the summer like I normally would, or to excavate or to do lab analyses. But a few people there, one of my graduate students, Daniela, she's from Ciudad de Mexico. She's a doctoral student. She's in Mexico City and finishing up her dissertation. We have a lot of close ties to UNAM, as Benjamin was saying. So my co-director for many years has been Luis Barba, who specializes in different science approaches to archaeology. So that includes things like remote sensing, that's like prospección geofísica, ways of understanding what's underneath the surface without excavating, using different techniques of soil resistivity, radar, and magnetometry. They also do chemistry studies. So we try to understand if there were organic residues from cooking foods and for other occupations that then get absorbed into the floors of the buildings that we excavated. So that's something that Luis and team, which we call the Equipo Pumas, when they come with their UNAM van and stay for usually a few weeks doing analyses of that sort. I'm also involved with so UNAM has two main areas for studying Mesoamerica. One is through the Instituto de Investigaciones Antropológicas, and that's where there's the doctoral program, and Luis and a lot of faculty are associated with the IIA of UNAM. Then there's also an interdisciplinary Programa de Estudios Mesoamericanos, and that I'm involved in as a tutor. So I serve on some committees for MA theses or doctoral theses. And in return, we have our students get very involved in the labs of UNAM. So, Daniela didn't actually go to UNAM. She went to Ibero and UDLA. But then a student that has just joined us at BU this year, Gabriel, had his MA from UNAM before he came here. And he's also from Ciudad de Mexico. And then in turn, some of my students, like I have a student, Maria, but she's from New Zealand. She's not Mexican, and she's working in the labs in UNAM. So there's a lot of close connections and collaboration, and I just hold the institution in highest esteem, and it's wonderful to be part of all sorts of projects involving UNAM. So that is a little introduction. Benjamin mentioned the new book I have that deals with the Conquista, or the Spanish invasion of Mesoamerica, because we were at the quincentennial, the 500th anniversary of those events. And I know that there's a lot going on in Mexico. A lot of it used to be when things were presencial or in person before the virus. There was a lot starting up in 2019. Now 2021, of course, that frames what people call the Aztec-Spanish War, that 1519 to 1521. And so I think there's a lot of commemoration and different ways of thinking about those events and how important they were, not just to Mexican history, which of course they were, but really global history, because that the events of 500 years ago, the Cortez expedition, then became a template used in other parts of Latin America. So it became another way of colonizing other parts of Latin America. And it really opened up, of course, what I think of as real globalization. So some people debate when did the world become global? But when, there was the Acapulco to Philippines galleon trade connecting the Pacific world to the Atlantic world, that's truly a global world. And so thinking about how that happened, and of course, events that were violent and tragic in many ways, but also created something new and important. And the ways that we think about that 500 years later. And some of that interest of doing this book, it came from working in Tlaxcala and reading a lot of history of the state of Tlaxcala, and of course the Tlaxcaltecas having a role as native allies to the Spaniards has always been of interest. And another thing, along with like Malinche or Malintzli, being rethought today. Oh, there's the cover of the book. So has anyone ever seen that mural before that was on the cover? Does anyone recognize that? The mural? No. We don't have any Tlaxcaltecas here, do we? Or people from... So this comes from the Presidencia in Tlaxcala, and the murals were painted by an artist named Desiderio Hernandez Xochitiotzin, who did the entire Presidencia, or the two floors of the entryway, have murals depicting the history of Tlaxcala, pre-Hispanic, colonial, up to the Republic. And some of these actually, so Tlaxcala had a scene from these on their license plates until recently. For a few years, that was on the Tlaxcala state license plates. So those images, having spent a lot of time in the state, they were always interesting to me. And I even had a personal connection to them because an artist that I worked with for 12 years, Pedro Cawantzin Hernandez, the artist who painted those murals was his great uncle. And really, unfortunately, Pedro died because of COVID in the spring. And so that's been my most direct impact of this virus, is a good friend and collaborator, Pedro. So now when I see that cover, I have a lot of memories of him and Tlaxcala and the collaborations we've had together. So there's my academic background, but I also grew up in Boston. I was born in New York, but I've lived in Boston, moved here when I was 6 or so. And so because of that, I've always, this is a town that really cares about its sports, and I enjoy playing sports and watching sports. And so I thought, rather than having just a fully academic conversation, we could also talk about that. Differences, in sports between the US and Mexico, or between this region, New England, and other parts of the United States. There are interesting differences. In Mexico, my most direct experience with sports has been when I was in Tlaxcala playing baseball in just community leagues that would play on Sundays. And it was a wonderful experience. A few years that I was involved in the summers, just playing with this local team that was called Unión Laguna, and that's a town that was on an ex-hacienda called La Laguna in northern Tlaxcala. And we would go around to other towns, or we'd have home games in this small rural hamlet north of Apizaco, and then other games in the region in northern Tlaxcala. And it was always a fun way to see different areas and different communities. And then at the end of the game, people would bring out pulque and beer and other things, and we would have a convivencia. So that was always a lot of fun too. And obviously soccer is the bigger sport in Mexico, but seeing a little of that connection with baseball has been fun. In my project in Teotihuacan, on Fridays, we would stop an hour early so that we could have a friendly game of football. right there at the site, and so that was also a lot of fun, and seeing some of the friends that excavate with us on their games if they made the playoffs or something on a Saturday or Sunday game. So I'm just curious. So are most people calling in from Mexico, or are some people in Boston here?
Just you and me.
Oh, we're the only ones in Boston. Okay.
All
But
right.
they want to come to Boston, and they will come to Boston, and we'll take them to the Red Sox and eat some lobster and clam chowder.
Right. Okay. Well, do you know the sports teams from here? What are some of the Boston's local sports teams? You could just write in chat if you want, or you could speak up. Or
you can show your socks. Tipsy?
Yeah. Is that Hernandez? Is that?
The Boston
Well, I'm sorry. What was that? Boston what?
Celtics.
Celtics. Yes. So for basketball, Celtics. Oh, there we go. People are putting
Bruins,
in
Sox, Pats, and Celtics. Okay, Priscilla.
Sox, Pats, and Celtics. That's the big four, right? So those are the big four professional teams. When I was a kid, only the Celtics were good. In the 1980s, the Celtics would win championships. The other teams, they made one final, but they lost. The 90s were horrible for Boston sports. Pessimo. There was no championships. Then, starting in 2000s, all of a sudden, the Boston team started winning a lot. So, most famously, the Patriots in football americano, that they won 6 Super Bowls. Their quarterback is still winning Super Bowls, even though he's 43 years old.
But David, perhaps you have also mixed loyalties because you were in New York, and traditionally the Red Sox have
They're the
lifelong
big
enemies.
rivals, right? No, I don't, because I was only there as a baby. I mean, I lived there the first not even year of my life. So, so I love New York as a city, but I don't like their sports teams. So the difference is like, Red Sox Yankees is a little bit like America Chivas in foot mexicano. It's a clásico, a big rivalry. And both
or America Pumas. America Pumas.
America Pumas. Yeah. And yeah, so the Red Sox then won 3 World Series, and the Celtics won 1, and the Bruins won 1 in the 2000s and 2010s. And now it looks like we're in a bad time again. All the teams it's like they're trying to lose. They trade the Red Sox traded the best player in baseball, Mookie Betts, to the Dodgers, and he won a Super Bowl. He won the championship, the World Series. And then the Patriots let Tom Brady go to Tampa Bay, and he just won a Super Bowl. So now they just seem like they want to lose again, and we're back to the 1980s or 1990s. So that's going to be a little bit depressing. So yeah, one thing, so Boston has all these 4 pro teams, and people pay very little attention to college teams compared to in some other parts of the country. So since I'm a college professor, I've taught in other parts of the country, like at the University of Alabama, and you might know that the University of Alabama for the university football is the best, and so they take football very seriously. But the college level, or University of Oklahoma, I also taught in, and Pennsylvania State University, they're all big football schools. My university, Boston University, doesn't even have a football team. They got rid of theirs in the 1990s, so they're more known for hockey sobre hielo. So that's, New England and the upper Midwest are the areas where people will play more hockey, because it's, of course, a sport from Canada. And there's some connections with, colder climates. People could skate. Right now, you could actually go skate on some ponds that have frozen over here. So that, that's where the origins of that sport were.
And David,
so
sorry for the interruption, but I mean, perhaps you would be the perfect person to talk to us a little bit about lacrosse, because in Mexico we know nothing about lacrosse.
Lacrosse,
And
yeah.
it could be very popular in Mexico.
It maybe could, yeah. I mean, so lacrosse is a Native American game, or American Indian game that comes from the upper Midwest of the United States. And so we joked that we could talk also about pre-Hispanic or pre-Columbian ball games. Mesoamerica, Mexico has a lot of those, and so ulami is the one that is most well known from the Aztec times, where with the rubber ball that would be bounced with anything except for the hands or feet. So you can use your hip or your elbows or knees. Has anyone seen a modern version of the Mesoamerican ball game, the ancient ball game? Sometimes there's reconstructor, like people who play it at Teotihuacan. Oh yeah, so Tipsy has seen it.
Yes, I saw it like 2 years ago. I went to Yucatan, Merida, and they were playing like that kind of play, but it was pretty interesting. It was really cool.
I mean, it's an interesting game. It's the way that the ball bounces. Here, let me actually, because I was just doing, I didn't really want to show slides.
Sorry, I have this, but I'll take it off.
Okay, for lacrosse. No, yeah, I'll talk. Yeah, let's. Let me just show one slide. I got interested in the Mesoamerican one, but my point is they're related. So this is just for a class this week we're talking about the Olmecs, Olmecas, and that term in Nahuatl, Olmecatl, is the people from the land of rubber. Olman is how Aztec groups talked about the hot areas around Veracruz, Tabasco, because the rubber tree is native to that region. And so then the people in the 16th century who would refer to people from that area, where they would call them Olmecatl. But of course, in archaeology, we talk about a much earlier civilization there. But those early Mesoamericans did something really remarkable. They mixed this latex, the sap that comes out of the rubber tree, with morning glory vines. And that gives the ball its spongy property. It allows it to bounce. And so they would use different recipes for, like, if they're making sandals like huaraches, or if they're using the ule to as an adhesive, like they would make a knife handle with a stone knife and connect it with ule. And so they would get different proportions based on how spongy or how hard they wanted it to be. And it's really amazing, this was over 3,000 years ago, this technology that they figured out. And it wasn't, until the process that we know as vulcanization was developed in the 19th century to make latex more malleable and serve as tires and other things. But this was a really, ingenious native Mesoamerican invention. And when the Aztec ball players went to Spain, and they even played in front of the Pope, and they played at the royal court, and Europeans were amazed. They had never seen rubber, so they didn't know that something could move like that. And so that there's some accounts of that. But in any case, all of that is related to a bigger American Indian tradition of ball sports. So in Mesoamerica, there wasn't just the hip ball game. There was like a handball game. There's a stick ball game, hitting almost like field hockey. So if you see the murals of Tepantitla and Teotihuacan, you can see different forms of ball games that people were playing. But in the upper Midwest, native peoples played lacrosse. And there are some relations in the way that, the games were sacred in nature. They weren't completely, just a secular sport. They were associated with like sometimes keeping the sun in motion or keeping the heavenly bodies moving. But in the upper Midwest, they didn't have rubber trees, so they didn't make any rubber balls. They would make them out of, some sort of leather covering and a stuffed ball. And there, they would have sticks with nets in them, and you pass the ball back and forth and try to score on a goal. And so that's part of a broader Native American tradition of ball playing. And then when English colonists and French colonists came to the upper Midwest, they commented on this game. I think that the word, is probably a French corruption of an indigenous term, lacrosse. Actually, no, I think it has to do with like it looks like a cross, like it looked like a cruce, right? So to early French fur trappers and settlers in that region. And so that's a game that's done more in the Eastern United States, or it's in certain universities. So Benjamin put one of the champions, Virginia, Northwestern. Okay, so one's in the East and one's in the Midwest. Those tend to be where you see a little more lacrosse. It's done in those parts of the country. It's done a little less in the West and in the South. I guess it's done in some of the South too. So it's
David,
not a sport.
That's a sport that you can play in almost any weather, except the weather we have now, not on snow.
Not with snow. But well, you could put on snowshoes maybe.
It would be easy to play in Mexico.
Right.
And also men and women play
There are
lacrosse.
women, there's women's lacrosse, and it's pretty big. It is it's a physical sport, so you're allowed to bump people like in hockey. And so it's a little related to hockey, but it's up in the air instead of down on the ground or on the ice. And it is played in a lot of prep schools, so preparatory schools. In the United States, there tend to be private. It's different, like it's not a public school, although public schools like around Boston, they also will have lacrosse teams too. But it's not as it's more a sport for high school and college, and there's not a successful professional league. It hasn't translated to pro sports.
So Priscilla and Stephanie and who else would like to start the UNAM Boston lacrosse team?
So another famous sporting event here in Boston is the Boston Marathon. Has anyone heard of that? The marathon? Okay, so some people, it's a famous marathon. It's one of the older ones in at least the United States. And it's always run here on what's called Patriots Day. And Patriots Day is supposed to commemorate, so New England and the Boston area was a little bit, I compare it sometimes in Mexico to where did Hidalgo do the grito? That was Dolores.
Dolores.
Right? Independencia. Yeah. So like Boston is like where some of the initial grito of independencia for the United States occurred. And that included fights with the British, between the colonists and the British, and a famous person named Paul Revere who rode on horseback with somebody else, but Paul Revere gets all of the credit usually. He rode westward to Concord and other communities west of Boston, and there was also the first fighting when the colonists and British fought at Lexington and Concord. That is Patriots Day, and so it's commemorating both a little bit of that ride out from Boston westward, but it's done in reverse. So it starts at a town called Hopkinton, which is 26 miles west of Boston, and then comes in to the city eastward. And it's a huge event. People have off, like kids don't have school, BU is closed, other universities are closed, and lots of people go out there and cheer the runners. It's also, I always remember it very fondly because, you know, as Benjamin notes, Boston has a serious winter, and by time of the marathon, it's starting to be spring. And so you have like the Red Sox are playing, it's warmer, there's flowers on the trees, and there's the marathon, and so you feel like we're done with winter and we can enjoy spring and summer and better weather. And so I always have fond memories. And I actually grew up at the 20-mile mark, like near the end of right near the road. It's on Commonwealth Avenue. My house where I grew up is right off of there, and so we would always have a cookout, like a barbecue, and go out and watch the runners. And so that's a big part of local sports, and a lot of people run. You see people running the route all year, even if there's snow and ice on the ground. So people are serious about running too. But there was recently a tragedy associated with the marathon. Does anyone remember what that was? No. La Bomba. Yeah. So there was a bombing. There was a terrorist bombing. Two brothers who at the end, at the finish line, put a few simple homemade explosives, and it didn't kill that many people. It killed a couple people. I don't remember how many, but it caused permanent damage, like loss of legs and limbs, to dozens of people, and it was very tragic. This was 2013, and it was a very difficult time for the city, and you know, people have commemorated it since then. Like the Red Sox won the World Series that year, and they brought the trophy to the finish line and put it there, and there was just a lot of like sports pride, but also like commemoration of a sad event. So that's one event where it's like you saw all of the sort of Boston sports unifying around this event.
One of the victims was a BU student, actually. And she was originally from China, studying mathematics, but she actually was also studying music. She was studying piano. So I knew her and I met her family. And around that time, we also started doing the music for healing in the BU Medical Center. The city hospital, como Hospital General for Boston, belongs to Boston University. And it was incredible for people with artificial limbs trying their first steps to be accompanied by musicians, and musicians to know that their music was empowering for people to move forward amid this tragedy. And that program still continues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that was a very difficult moment. It's one of the key sort of sports legacies, though, around Boston is Marathon Monday, and there's always a Red Sox game early in the day so that people can leave and then see the end of the race. So there's a lot of sports. Unfortunately, it hasn't been run, and now it's postponed until October. It usually is in April, but people are hoping that it can be run again. There was one race that in Mexico that I really wanted to do, but I wasn't in the country when it was run, or else I would have loved to have done it. So when I'm at Teotihuacan, I like to run around the periférico, the cobble road that goes around the pyramids. And, you know, one of the things I like to say is, you know, when you're running and you're feeling tired, you can get inspiration by looking at the Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon and say, I mean, look at these people built these amazing monuments. I can continue to run around them. It shouldn't be too hard to, you know, you use it as motivation. Like, look at the amazing things that people can do. But so sometimes around Teotihuacan they have races, but one that really interested me, some of you might know that the Aztecs would have a system of runners, like relay runners. So it's said that Moctezuma had on his table fresh fish from Veracruz every day. And so that was run up from Puerto de Veracruz up through Puebla and into Tenochtitlan. And so there was a relay race where you could make teams and do that same run. And I wish I had been able to do that. So like run from Veracruz to Mexico City in relays. I certainly couldn't do that myself, but probably only some super marathoners could do that. The last theme I had, and then I'm very interested in hearing any questions or comments that people have, is just here in Boston, of course, we mentioned a little bit hockey, but there are other winter sports that people play. So just yesterday, I went skiing with my son. So we have snow, skiing, downhill skiing on the snow is a big one. Ice skating and hockey are other big ones. And so that's something, there is like in Boston, because the seasons are so strong, the difference between winter and spring and summer and fall, they have very distinct, feelings to them and temperatures, so that the sports cycle conforms to that seasonal cycle as well. So I wonder if anyone has questions or comments. Yeah, Frank?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I have a question for your professional life. And it is why you decided to focus on Mesoamerican or Central American archaeology and not in other, like for example, the Greek or Egypt archaeology.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Really, I guess it's a little bit of family history and a little bit of a professor. And I don't have Mexican heritage. I do have Hispanic heritage though. So my grandparents, paternal grandparents, the Carballo side, they fled Spain during the Civil War when Franco was the dictator in Spain. And so they and some of their brothers and sisters stayed in Spain and fought. Some died in the war, and then some came to the Americas. And my grandparents came to Cuba first and got married there. And then some of their brothers and sisters did a diaspora to Venezuela, Uruguay, and mine came to New York. And so because of that, I've always had a family that's transatlantic, that has people in the Americas and people in Spain. And so that history interested me. Having abuelos who spoke Spanish, then I learned it not as a native speaker, but as bilingual at an early age. And then I just had a great professor. I was studying political science. I wasn't studying anthropology or archaeology. And a professor had a class on, it was called Archaeoastronomy. So astronomy viewed by people in the past. So that could include the famous calendars of the Mayas, or the fact in Teotihuacan, the sun pyramid is aligned to the sunset on 2 days of the year that split up the year into 260, which is the ritual calendar, and 105, the remainder for the solar year. And so all that stuff was fascinating to me, and it really called my attention to archaeology. And he took us there in the January of 1995, just on a 2-week excursion, and we saw amazing things. Like, he was a prominent professor, so he had a lot of connections. And we went to Templo Mayor and got a tour from Eduardo Matos, and we went to Teotihuacan and got a tour from Ruben Cabrera, who the project that I first worked on, and Xochicalco and Cacaxtla and Cantona and other places. And that really I changed direction. So even though I had my carrera, my major was in political science, then I decided to apply for graduate school in archaeology.
Thank you. That's fascinating, yeah. David.
Thanks, Frank. Larry, do you have a question?
Yeah, I was reading that Boston was proposed, or I don't know if that's the word, to hold the Olympic Games for 2024. I don't know, maybe in 5 years or 10 years ago. But was it true? And how was it? Like, how is the perception of the Olympic Games there? Like, is there like this like initiative like to hold the Olympic Games maybe in the future, or is it like a very like, how is the impression there?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in a nutshell, the Olympics are very political. They cost a lot of money, and for a country to take them on these days is very costly. And so the countries that do, I think either they're very they want to promote themselves in some way, that that the government really wants attention on the country, or they might have done it already and have the existing infrastructure. And so when Boston was putting together a plan for the Olympics, they were thinking of, all right, how could we do something cheaper? And like using the universities, BU, Harvard, UMass Boston, and others, because they have dorms, they have athletic fields, and so some of it could be used that way. But still, the price tag was pretty high, and so there was not widespread support in the city for it, and so the plan just fell apart. And it went, so that Olympics, or the one that's next coming to the United States, is going to go to Los Angeles. But Los Angeles had the advantage of having hosted the Olympics before, and so they have some facilities that already lend themselves to it. And they were building the new stadium for where now the Rams and the Chargers play football, and so they were going to have this brand new stadium, and so that'll work for the Olympics. Yeah, Boston doesn't have, the New England Patriots play about 30-40 minutes south of the city, and so that's not right in the city, that big theater, or I'm sorry, stadium. And there really is no, there's the baseball stadium, Fenway Park, but there isn't one of that size that could hold 100,000 people. Harvard has a big coliseum, but it's old and it doesn't have that many seats available. So yeah, so one of the things that's fascinating for me, and I like to tell students here, like, of course the two pyramids in Teotihuacan were both reconstructed at key moments for Mexico's celebration of the country. So the Pyramid of the Sun, I think many of you probably know, was reconstructed in 1910 because that was the centenario of independence. And so that was like going to be a key monument to reconstruct. And then of course, the Pyramid of the Sun, does anyone know when that, I'm sorry, the Moon, Pyramid of the Moon, and the Calzada de los Muertos, when was that reconstructed?
Who knows? I was there.
You were there. So that was done right in the 60s, but for leading up to the Olympics coming to Mexico City in 1968. And so they brought then the Olympic torch and ran it up the Pirámide de la Luna, which had just recently been reconstructed. So the two pyramids then, have these key moments in Mexico's national history. They were as the reason, or one of the base roots of their archaeological reconstruction. So there is an Olympics and sports connection with Teotihuacan.
Thank you so much.
And political propaganda.
I remember, so when we were excavating at the Moon Pyramid, I didn't see her, but there was like we saw this big commotion happening. And it's funny because she's in the news again recently, but Britney Spears had come to visit the site, and she walked up the adosada of the Moon Pyramid too. So that was funny. So it is such an important site that gets a lot of diplomats and foreign dignitaries. There were one time recently when we were working at Plaza de las Columnas, the president, let's see, God, who was the president then? I guess it would have been, was it Calderon? No, it was Peña Nieto, I think, with Angela Merkel, came in a helicopter and buzzed like around us a few times. So some people get helicopter tours, other people, come to the site and see it in person. Any other questions, comments?
Maybe I have another one.
Sure.
I want to know how important do you think are the sports for the U.S. Society, and especially for you?
It's a good question. It's really, I mean, one of the weird things about the United States is that the sports that are most popular, or I should say, the sport that is most popular in the world is, of course, football, soccer, and it's not as popular in the United States. And all these sports that are not very popular elsewhere, like American football and baseball in particular, aren't as popular other places. Basketball, I think, is one that is a little more international. And basketball actually was made here in Massachusetts. So it was invented in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is west of Boston, by a man named James Naismith in a gym, and he put baskets for peaches, like fruit baskets, up on the wall, and he had people shooting in them. And so that's how basketball started. And so that's become a little more international. Baseball is popular in a lot of the Caribbean world, of course, like República Dominicana, Cuba, Venezuela, Panama. You see some attention, and East Asia. So Japan and Korea play baseball. But American football is really not played anywhere. It's very violent, of course. And there's a lot of, it's interesting now seeing how the different leagues have dealt with racial and social justice issues. So, of course, here in the United States, we're having, for the last year, the attention to racial and social justice, things like the Black Lives Matter movement. And so, not so many years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers, took a knee to protest the American anthem. And he was basically not allowed, like persona non grata in the NFL, not allowed, no team picked him up. He was dropped by the 49ers. It's ridiculous. And but now you can see that the league has finally changed, but it's, the NFL is a more conservative league, where if you look at the NBA with, the basketball league, they took a very social justice forward approach. And that, players will have, last season they had social justice sayings instead of their names. People are often taking knees or linking arms at the national anthem. There is even one team, the Dallas Mavericks, who has decided not to play the national anthem anymore before basketball games. So right now there's those sorts of politics about social and racial justice and racism that are part of the conversation for all the sports, but particularly, I would say, basketball and football.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Any last question?
Or comments?
Oh, Larry?
Yeah, I was curious about the recent excavations in the downtown in Mexico, because I was reading this news that they were saying that the excavation, they found I don't know how to say, a basamento or something like that in a parking lot of a hotel. And it was very funny, because they were saying that probably the whole downtown, you could be in the top of any pyramid, in the downtown in Mexico City. And it's very funny, how even in our parking lots in Mexico City, you can find pyramids. What's your opinion of this? The discoveries of these pyramids or basements in Mexico City?
Yeah, it's great. Good question. I like to compare Mexico City with Rome, because Rome has the same issues of whenever they try to expand their metro, they're going to hit into vestigios of earlier occupations. Of course, if you go to Metro Balderas, then you see that round temple in the metro stop. And so, two projects have been very key. One is the Proyecto Templo Mayor, who, Matos started that, but now Leonardo Lopez Luján has been directing it for the last, I think, 20 or so years. And Then the other one is the Proyecto Arqueológico Urbano, and that Raúl Barrera is the director for that project. And they've discovered a lot of things in the Centro Histórico, like in the Zócalo, under the cathedral, under the street, I forget what the street's called, that's right behind the cathedral. But so there are things like they found, there's the Centro Cultural Española, there's the Calmecac, so the elite school of Tenochtitlan, and there you can actually, it's nice because you can, I don't know if anyone's gone in, but you can go into the basement and see the basamientos of the ancient Calmecac. They found the ball court. They found, Raúl recently discovered the what's called the Huachicalco, which is a round altar where they cremated the Mexica emperors, probably including Huitzotl, which Leonardo is probably excavating Huitzotl's tomb. He was the emperor before the final Moctezuma. And right next to there is also the Tzompantli, the big skull rack. And so those finds have been very important, a lot of attention. Of course, the Palacio Nacional is right on top of Moctezuma's palace. Then there was another palace, Axayacat's palace, that's sort of across the Zócalo from there. So there's a very rich information, but these are some of the most logistically difficult digs in the world because first, it's one of the biggest cities in the world. There's a lot of just a lot of activity, but then it's also a high water table. So archaeologists have to dredge water out to be able to excavate, which is sort of a mixed bag because the humid soil makes good preservation. So Leonardo has discovered some like headdresses with origami-like paper in them that's still preserved 500 years later because of that high water table. But it makes it very difficult and slow to be able to excavate there. Any final questions?
Well, David, thank you so much. It's been an incredible conversation. I'm sure that everybody is just in awe of learning so much about Mexico from a Mexican scholar in Boston, and also your enthusiasm about sports in Boston and ways in which we can connect and play. And I'm sure that many of our young Pumas in this Invierno Puma will be visiting Boston very soon, and we'll be looking for the opportunity of meeting you in person, and also of coming to the sports or learning to play lacrosse. That would be great to have the first lacrosse team in Mexico.
Yeah.
And I've seen both men and women playing lacrosse, and I think even a nephew of my wife is a lacrosse coach. But the women teams of lacrosse are just amazing. I also had a former student who was a lacrosse champ. And well, in Mexico, if we use the metro, we're very used to bomb one another. So I'm sure that we have very good training.
Great. It was so wonderful to speak with everyone about two of my loves, which are Mexico and Mexican archaeology and sports. So I hope you can come visit Boston and we can meet in person one day once this pandemic's over and either talk about Mexican anthropology and archaeology or sports. Mucho gusto.